This is part 3 of the animal diversity lectures. We left off talking about animals with tissues. Reminder that animals that do not have tissues are called parazoa, and the only group of animals living today that are parazoa are sponges. Actually, the only animals ever that did not have tissues are sponges. Sponges don't have true tissues, but the eumetazoa, which is all the other animals, do possess true tissues. And specifically, these tissues allow for coordination, the nervous tissue, and movement, the muscle tissue. Epithelial tissue is one of the 4 tissue types. Epithelial tissues are coverings and linings, and also will serve as the tissue from which the glands are produced, like your sweat glands and your oil glands. So epithelial tissue is coverings and linings primarily. If the tissue is composed of a single layer of cells, we call it simple epithelia. If it has 2 or more layers of cells, we call it stratified. And then we name it also by the shape of the cells. If the cells are flat, they are called squamous cells. We find simple squamous tissue simple squamous epithelial tissue is the thinnest, most delicate epithelial tissue that there is. So you're only going to find that in areas that are well protected. For example, the air sacs, alveoli of your lungs, they're microscopic little tiny air sacs, and they are composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So are your blood capillaries. These are microscopic. The diameter of a blood capillary is actually a little smaller than the diameter of a red blood cell. So the red blood cell has to kind of squish itself in order to get through the capillaries. So simple squamous is the alveoli and the blood capillaries, and then the stratified squamous is found in the skin, the mouth, the vagina, any openings to the exterior. Cuboidal cells are a little bit taller than squamous cells, but they're not really as tall as the columnar cells, so they're medium height, I guess you could say. We find simple cuboidal cells in many of our glands, and our kidney tubules are simple cuboidal. Columnar are the tall cells. They're column shaped. They're columnar. Simple columnar is found lining our digestive tract, and typically will also be lined with microvilli, which are little folds in the surface of the cell, and those folds increase the surface area so that the digestive tract can absorb more nutrients. And then we have pseudostratified, which is really not layers, but the cells are different shapes and sizes, so they appear layered. However, all of the cells in pseudostratified epithelial tissue touch the basement membrane or the bottom of the tissue. And we find pseudostratified in the respiratory tract, and often pseudostratified contains cilia. So it is ciliated in the respiratory tract. That cilia sweeps up and out so that it can sweep mucus and harmful pathogens up and out of your respiratory tract so you don't get deep lung infections. Transitional means that the tissue, when the tissue gets stretched. So for example, the urinary bladder. When the urinary bladder is full, the cells of the urinary bladder lining the urinary bladder would appear more flat and round like the squamous cells. And when the urinary bladder is empty, they would appear more cuboidal and columnar. So that's transitional. This is a picture of squamous epithelial tissue like it would look if you were looking down on the tissue. The squamous cells look almost like kind of pointy fried eggs. They look like my fried eggs because mine, I put a bunch in the pan at one time and they don't stay separated, so they end up looking like that. But it still tastes good. But this would be like a cross section through the skin, and that's showing you the different layers of the skin. And what the squamous epithelial tissue looks like, or what the stratified, I'm sorry, this is simple, this is stratified. This is layers of squamous cells. Sorry, my writing is horrible. And then this is what cuboidal tissue would look like in cross section. This is just a cross section through the kidney tubules. The kidney has millions of tubes called nephrons, and those tubes are lined by simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. And this is showing you the columnar cells versus the pseudostratified cells. Columnar cells, remember, are found in the digestive tract, and the folds that you see on the surface of these cells are called microvilli. You can also see mucus on the surface of these cells. And these goblet cells produce that mucus. One thing that you can tell that they're columnar cells is that the nuclei are all parallel to each other. They're all down at the bottom of the tissue. Whereas in the pseudostratified epithelial tissue, the cells are not the same size and the nucleus is not in the same place. So if you look at this tissue under a microscope, it appears to be layered, even though all the cells actually contact the basement membrane or the bottom here. Every cell contacts the bottom. The pseudostratified tissue also has goblet cells, but this is not microvilli, it's cilia. In the columnar epithelial cells, those folds are called microvilli and therefore increased absorption. But in the pseudostratified epithelial cells, that is cilia, which is little hairs, and they are to sweep mucus away from the deepest parts of the lungs. And this is transitional. It doesn't show a picture of it. So this would be like the bladder empty. And then if it was full, those cells would be a lot flatter. So epithelial tissues form coverings and linings. Connective tissues are probably the most diverse, but instead of just being cells connected to cells, connective tissues are cells that are surrounded by a matrix. So the matrix that surrounds the cells consists of a non-living substance. So the living cells in connective tissue are surrounded by a ground substance and also protein fibers. And the ground substance and the protein fibers together form the matrix. The primary cell of connective tissues is the fibroblast, and it produces those protein fibers. It makes fibers like collagen, elastin, and reticular fibers. There are other cells that you can find in connective tissues: macrophages, lymphocytes, leukocytes. These are all cells of the immune system. But the matrix is what gives the tissue its density. So we have loose connective tissue, and then we have very hard, tough, solid connective tissue. So we have loose connective tissue, which is sometimes called areolar tissue. It has all the cells that connective tissue can have: fibroblasts, macrophages, which are the big eaters, the trash cans of the immune system. Lymphocytes are white blood cells. Neutrophils help when there's an infection. This loose areolar tissue is found in the below the epidermis of the skin. It has collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. And then there's fibrous connective tissue that is mostly collagen, and its matrix is more it's not solid, but it's thicker than the loose connective tissue. There is irregular fibrous connective tissue in the skin in the lower level of the dermis. The areolar is in the upper level of the dermis. And then tendons and ligaments are called regular fibrous connective tissue. Then we have cartilage and bone, which are structural connective tissue. The primary cells of cartilage are chondrocytes, and then there are chondroblasts that produce cartilage. There's hyaline, fibrocartilage, some different types of cartilage. Fibrocartilage is tougher. The intervertebral discs that we have that support our vertebrae, that needs to be really tough, so that's fibrocartilage. Fetal bones are composed of hyaline cartilage that eventually form into bone, develop into bone. The cartilage develops into bone. And then the matrix of cartilage, of course, is very solid, very tough. Bone has cells called osteocytes, and then osteoblast, osteoclast. Bone has some collagen and elastic fibers, and the matrix, of course, is a very hard cement-like matrix. We have bone tissue in vertebrate skeletons, in our endoskeletons. And then there's adipose tissue, which is also a loose connective tissue, and it's fat tissue. Then there's blood, which is a connective tissue, does not have any protein fibers in it. The matrix is blood plasma. This is what loose or areolar tissue looks like. You can see all three different protein fiber types. The collagen is very thick. The elastin is very thin. And there should be reticular fibers, like right here. Reticular fibers, which are kind of medium size. And the fibroblast, these are the cells that produce the fibers. This is what loose areolar tissue looks like under a microscope. This is a drawing of what it looks like under a microscope. Fibrous connective tissue, the fibers are lined up more. Sometimes the fibrous tissue is irregular. We find irregular fibrous connective tissue in the lower dermis, the lower level of the dermis of the skin. The dermis is beneath the epidermis, and there are two layers of the dermis, so it's in the lower layer of the dermis. And then tendons and ligaments are regular fibrous connective tissue. Tendons connect muscle to bone, ligaments connect bone to bone.